In today's file, we are exploring how does one survive a WAAAGH by being too pathetic to kill. Let's discover the documented account of Guardsman Tertius Mordecai of the 47th Brokian Infantry, a man whose cowardice was so profound, so systematically complete, that it achieved a state of strategic transcendence, stopping WAAAGH in a way 10 Space Marine chapters could only dream of, by being a profound disappointment. Not through courage, not through tactics, but through being, according to recovered Ork logs, not even worth the time to crump. Before the WAAAGH came to Brocus Vixteen, Guardsman Tertius Mordecai had already established himself as the regiment's most accomplished avoider of responsibility. His service record, a document which itself only survived because the Ork who found it assumed it was a type of particularly unappetizing hardtack, did not so much list failures as it chronicled a career of triumphant evasion. It noted, for instance, a record-breaking 247 consecutive days of latrine duty, a post he held with the kind of grim dedication most guardsmen reserve for a trench line. It also noted his participation in 0 combat engagements, a perfect score he maintained by claiming 89 sick days, a number which correlated with suspicious accuracy to the number of scheduled combat drills. The regimental commissar, one Uldrich Stenmark, had attempted to execute Mordecai for cowardice no less than 17 times. Each attempt failed due to what the official records describe as administrative irregularities, a bureaucratic term meaning the universe found the situation too funny to allow it to end. The failures included, but were not limited to, Mordecai fainting preemptively, cases of mistaken identity, his paperwork mysteriously misfiling him as already executed, and his uncanny ability to be conducting critical latrine maintenance during every single scheduled execution. Eventually, the commissar gave up, filed Mordecai under tactical reserve, a category usually reserved for ammunition that might explode, and tried very hard to forget he existed.
The first sign of WAAAGH Gutsmasher was not the characteristic rumble of Ork war engines or the thunderous battle cry of 1,000,000 greenskins. It was the sudden spike in latrine usage among the 47th Brokian Infantry. When the Auspex arrays detected the approaching Ork fleet, Mordecai had already secured himself a position conducting essential waste management oversight in Latrine Block 7, the furthest facility from the predicted landing zones. Colonel Braxton addressed his men with the traditional pre-battle speech. "Men of Brockus, today we stand against the green tide. Today we prove that humanity's courage." Mordecai wasn't there. He was checking the structural integrity of the latrine pits, all of them, repeatedly. The Imperial defensive line stretched across the Caesarian plains. 15,000 guardsmen in reinforced trenches, 200 Lehman Russ battle tanks, 50 Basilisk artillery pieces, one guardsman hiding in a latrine, claiming irritable bowel syndrome. The invasion began at dawn. WAAAGH Gutsmasher brought everything: Stompas, Gargants, kill cruisers, and most terrifyingly, War Boss Gutsmasher himself, a creature so large that smaller orcs used him for shade. as the green tide crashed against the Imperial lines, as Lasfire met Daka in apocalyptic symphony, Mordecai made the decision that would accidentally save Brachus 7. He would stay hidden until either the Imperium won or everyone forgot he existed. He had no idea he was about to achieve both. The Imperial line held for exactly 37 minutes, a respectable showing that would later be rounded down to instantaneous collapse by Imperial tacticians. The 47th Brochian Infantry's after-action report, what little survived, describes the battle as catastrophic on a scale that requires new vocabulary to properly articulate. War boss Guardsman personally led the charge, grabbed a Lehman Russ trank, and used it to play a game that bore a striking resemblance to golf, only with screaming guardsmen for balls. Commissar Stenmark died heroically in the first wave, stepped on by a Stampa while reloading his bolt pistol after executing 3 guardsmen for insufficient enthusiasm. The irony was lost on everyone except Mordecai, who witnessed the event through a crack in the latrine door and made a small, terrified, squeaking sound. Within the hour, the Imperial position had been reclassified from defensive line to scrapyard and corpse repository. The Vox channels became a cacophony of despair. Firebase Alpha is gone. Charlie Company is, they're using our own men as ammunition. Delta, we surrender, followed by a sound that confirmed the Orks did not accept the surrender. Through it all, Mordecai remained in Latrine Block 7, barricaded with stolen emergency rations. The Orks, in their rampage, destroyed everything of military value. Command bunkers, crumped. Supply depots, looted, then crumped. Vehicle pools, looted, painted red, then crumped. Medicae stations, crumped. Pain boys took the good bits. Mess holes, crumped after disappointment with food quality. Latrines, ignored completely. This strategic oversight was codified by an Ork knob named Scragga, who conducted a brief sensory analysis of Latrine Block 7 and declared, "That's where the Humies do their business, not worth crumping." This assessment, based on the universal Ork aversion to smells they did not personally create, saved Mordecai's life. By the 6th hour, WAAAGH Gutsmasher had achieved a victory so total it was almost inconvenient. The Orks set about their traditional post-victory activities, arguing, looting, and building monuments to themselves from enemy corpses. War boss Gutsmasher stood atop the ruined command bunker and bellowed. His war was strong. And then, a problem arose that had no place in Ork philosophy. The first sign something was wrong came when a Gretchen asked, "Boss, where'd all the Humies go?" Gutsmasher looked around. The battlefield was littered with corpses, yes, but there were no living enemies left to fight. The few surviving guardsmen had either fled beyond pursuit or died in the wasteland. "Find me something to crump!" Gutsmasher roared. By hour 18, the war had encountered a foe far more insidious than laser cannons or orbital bombardments. A profound, soul-crushing boredom. An Ork requires a good fight, in much the same way a star requires hydrogen.
It is not merely a preference, it is the fundamental fuel for its existence. Deprived of anything worth crumping, the psychic field that held the war together began to suffer from what can only be described as an enthusiasm failure. Without enemies, the war began to argue with itself. The evil sons wanted to leave, the Goths wanted to dig in, and the Death Skulls were quietly looting from both. Gutsmasher held his war together through sheer force of will and liberal application of his power claw to dissenting skulls. But the cracks were showing. Gutsmasher was losing control. He was about to discover that his glorious victory had failed to account for one critical factor: Guardsman Mordecai's bowels and their increasingly urgent needs.
Mordecai had survived 4 days on emergency rations and latrine cistern water, but he faced a problem that threatened to expose his position. He needed to use a different latrine. The one he was hiding in was, to use technical terms, at capacity. Under cover of darkness, Orks were mostly drunk on fungus beer. Mordecai attempted to sneak to latrine block 6. He made it exactly 3 steps before stepping on a piece of scrap metal. The clang echoed across the silent camp. Every orc in a 300-meter radius turned toward the sound. Mordecai froze, his bowels clenched in terror so severe it solved his original problem. A massive knob, Skull Splitter, approached. Each footstep shook the ground. His chain chopper revved hungrily. He looked down at Mordecai, who had assumed the fetal position and was quietly whimpering the litany of "Please don't see me," not an official Imperial prayer. Skull Splitter examined the trembling guardsman. He poked him with one massive finger. Mordecai fainted. The knob snorted in disgust. This one's already dead from fear. He kicked Mordecai aside like refuse. Not worth the effort. Other orcs gathered, their knuckles dragging with the eager anticipation of violence. They peered down on the unconscious, soiled, and frankly disappointing human, and a wave of collective anticlimax washed over them. An orc's entire conceptual framework of the universe is divided into 3 categories: things to fight, things to loot, and things that help you do the first 2. Mordecai, tragically, did not fit into any of those categories. He wasn't an enemy. He wasn't even an obstacle. He was, in the grand cosmic scheme of things, a rounding error. And you cannot declare a glorious victory over a rounding error. "Boss," Skull Splitter called to Gutsmasher, "we found something. Not sure it counts as a Humie."
War Boss Gutsmasher stood over Mordecai's unconscious form. "Can it fight?" he asked. A Gretchen poked Mordecai with a stick. Mordecai whimpered and curled tighter. "Don't think so, boss." Gutsmasher considered this. In the orc hierarchy of worth, Mordecai ranks somewhere below a Gretchen with a limp. "It's not even worth feeding to the squigs," Gutsmasher declared. "Leave it." But leaving it raised an uncomfortable question. If this was all that remained, had they really won a great victory? An existential crisis rippled through the WAAAGH. The orcs had won too completely. The only survivor was so pathetic that killing him would actually diminish their victory. A WAAAGH is typically dispersed at its defeat, the death of its war boss, or simply when it runs out of enemies. They hadn't been defeated. Gutsmasher lived, but they had run out of enemies worth fighting.
The situation was perhaps best summarized by a mech boy, who, in a moment of uncharacteristic clarity, gestured a greasy claw towards latrine block 7. "We came for a war, and all we got was dat." He pointed at Mordecai, who had crawled back to his latrine and resumed hiding. The psychological effect was devastating. Orks began to question if the enemy was weak or if they were simply good at beating up the pathetic. These were not thoughts an orc was equipped to handle. By the 7th day, WAAAGH Gutsmasher faced complete dissolution, not from enemy action, but from the presence of a single coward so comprehensively pathetic that he had broken the fundamental logic of orc warfare. There was no glory in crumping someone who had negative combat value. And without glory, without a proper fight, what was the point of a war?
The evil sons left first. "We's gonna find some proper enemies," their war boss declared, "ones that don't hide in their own filth." The bad moons followed shortly after, grumbling about the poor quality of loot. "Even their teeth are worthless. That one's fell out from fear." Gutsmasher tried to maintain order, but the damage was done. The psychic gestalt field of the wall was weakening. Without the unifying purpose of a good fight, the combined war bands and tribes will then break up through infighting and inter-clan rivalry. Meanwhile, Mordecai had established a routine. Dawn. Check if orcs were still there. They were. Morning. Inventory remaining rations. Noon. Brief panic attack. Afternoon. Attempt to convince himself this was all a nightmare. Evening. Eat half a ration bar. Night. Whimper quietly. He had no idea his continued existence was destroying the WAAAGH from within. The remaining orc leadership held what could generously be called a council of war, and more accurately described as a shouting match with occasional violence. "We should attack the next world," argued War Boss Grimguts of the Goths. "With what momentum?" countered Big Mech Sparknuts. "The boys are already wandering off. We look like we scared of one Humy." "We's not scared," Grimguts roared. "Then why haven't we killed it?" Because Grimguts struggled with the concept. "It's too pathetic. There's no honor in it. Since when do orcs care about honor? Since killing it would make us look worse, like we needed a whole war to kill one coward." The argument continued for hours. 14 orcs were killed in philosophical disagreements. 3 more left in disgust.
Something unprecedented in the history of the Imperium occurred. An orc war and a single guardsman had reached a state of mutual existence where neither could act without losing. The orcs couldn't kill Mordecai because it would be admitting they needed to. There was no glory in it. It would make their entire victory look pathetic. He wasn't even fighting back. Mordecai couldn't leave because he was surrounded by orcs. His terror paralysis was absolute. The latrine was the only place they wouldn't go. His legs had stopped working from fear. Imperial scholars would later call this the Mordecai paradox, a military situation where cowardice became a defensive position so absolute that it transcended into strategic value. War Boss Gutsmasher, in desperation, ordered his boys to try to make Mordecai fight. Attempt 1. They left weapons near the latrine. Result: Mordecai didn't even look at them.
Attempt 2. They shouted challenges and insults. Result: Mordecai fainted again. Attempt 3. A pain boy tried to fix him to make him more combat-worthy. Result: Mordecai's terror reached such levels that he briefly died, then came back to life just to continue being afraid. Attempt 4. They brought in a weird boy to read his mind. Result: the weird boy touched Mordecai's thoughts and immediately suffered a seizure from the sheer concentrated cowardice. His last words were, It's like looking into an anti-Hua."
Mordecai's cowardice had transcended mere personal failing. It had become metaphysical. His fear was so pure, so absolute, that it created what the Orks called negative fight value. He wasn't just not worth fighting, his presence actively diminished the value of every fight around him. Orks who got too close to Latrine Block 7 reported sudden doubts about their own strength, existential questions about the meaning of victory, decreased desire to crump, in severe cases, brief moments of introspection. One nob was found sitting quietly, staring at his chopper, muttering, "What's the point of crumpet if some gits won't even fight back?" He was immediately executed for un-orky behavior, but the damage was spreading. The WAAAGH energy field, that psychic manifestation of orc aggression and confidence, was failing. Mech-boy creations started malfunctioning. Shooters jammed more than usual. Trucks wouldn't start. Their red paint seemed less red. Stumpers stumbled. Even the squigs seemed depressed. The weird boys reported that the warp around Brockus 7 had taken on a flavor of disappointment. One described it as like expecting a good fight and finding out your opponent wet himself and died before you could hit him. Gutsmasher made a desperate decision. "We leave! This world is cursed, full of coward spirits and shameful victories." But even this declaration felt hollow. They weren't being driven off. They were leaving because one guardsman was too pathetic to kill.
Gutsmasher began its withdrawal from Brockus 7, but it was not the usual orc departure of violence and looting. It was quiet, subdued, embarrassed. Orcs loaded into their cruisers without the traditional fighting over seats. Mech boys packed their equipment without arguing about whose gubbings were whose. Even the Gretchens seemed less likely to be kicked. As Gutsmasher's personal cruiser prepared to leave, the war boss took one last look at the ruined Imperial base. Somewhere down there, in a latrine, was the single most pathetic creature in the galaxy. Boss asked his lieutenant, Should we at least bomb it from orbit?" Gutsmasher considered this, then shook his massive head. No, let it live with its shame. Besides, he couldn't finish the thought, but every orc present understood. Bombing Mordecai from orbit would be admitting he mattered enough to bomb. Mordecai emerged from Latrine Block 7 12 hours after the last orc cruiser left orbit. He had survived 15 days on 7 ration bars, cistern water, his own tears, whatever nutrition fear-induced adrenaline provided. He stumbled through the empty orc camp, past abandoned weapons and discarded scrap. The orcs had left so demoralized that they hadn't even properly looted. The only sign of their presence was graffiti on the command bunker that read, "Wah, Gutsmasher was here, but it wasn't worth it."
When the Imperial Relief Force arrived, led by 3 companies of Mordian Iron Guard and elements of the Cadian 445th, they expected to find either total annihilation, ongoing combat, Ork occupation requiring massive assault. They found one traumatized guardsman, an abandoned Ork camp, the most confusing after-action report in Imperial history. Colonel Kurtz of the Mordian Iron Guard interviewed Mordecai personally. "Guardsman, you're saying the Orks just left?" "Yes, sir." Mordecai hadn't stopped shaking. "After completely defeating our forces?" "Yes, sir." "Because you were hiding in a latrine?" I think so, sir." "And they saw you?" "Multiple times, sir. They kept poking me with sticks." "But didn't kill you?" "They said I wasn't worth it, sir." Colonel Kurtz stared at Mordecai for a very long time. Then he said the only thing that made sense. "Report to the Medicae. Then report to... Actually, I don't know where to send you." The Administratum faced an unprecedented challenge: how to classify what had happened on Brockus 7th. Victory? The Orks had left. Defeat? The Imperial forces were destroyed. Draw? One guardsman survived. Other? There was no category for enemy left from existential crisis. After 47 different committees reviewed the case, they settled on classification: strategic redeployment following environmental unsuitability. Mordecai was classified as surviving tactical asset. No one mentioned the latrine.
Word of WAAAGH Gutsmash's defeat spread through Ork space, though the details were heavily distorted. Version 1. Gutsmasha found enemies so weak they wasn't worth crumpin'. Version 2. The Humies had some kind of anti-WAAAGH weapon. Version 3. Brockus 7 is cursed, full of coward spirits. Version 4. Gutsmasha got bored and left, closest to the truth. The result was that no Ork WAAAGH would approach Brockus 7 for the next 3 centuries. The planet became known as "dat place where fightin' goes to die." Meanwhile, in Imperial space, the story transformed into propaganda. Lone guardsman holds line against entire WAAAGH. Heroic last stand on Brockus 7. The miracle of Latrine Block 7. Quickly redacted. The Departamento Munitorum, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, decided Mordecai needed to be decorated. Not because they understood what happened, but because he was the only survivor. The Orks had left. Therefore, he must have done something heroic. The paperwork was already filed. The ceremony was held on Brockus 7, now being rebuilt. Lord General Militant Corvan himself arrived to present the Medallion Crimson, the Order of the Golden Throne, and the Star of Terra. Guardsman Tertius Mordecai, the Lord General announced to the assembled regiment. All new recruits, as the original was dead. Your actions in the face of the enemy exemplify the highest traditions of the Imperial Guard. Your stalwart defense... Mordecai fainted. The Lord General continued speaking to Mordecai's unconscious form for another 10 minutes, pinned the medals to his chest, and left, muttering about overcome with honor. When Mordecai woke up, he was a hero of the Imperium, defender of Brockus 7, and bearer of the Golden Throne. He promptly hid in the nearest latrine.
The strangest part of the Brockus 7th incident was its lasting impact. On the Orks, war boss Gutsmasher never recovered psychologically. His WAAAGH dissolved completely within months. He was last seen starting fights with increasingly smaller opponents, trying to recapture his confidence. He was eventually killed by a particularly aggressive Gretchen who caught him during an existential crisis. Pulling a Brockus entered Ork vernacular, meaning winning so hard you lose. Several Ork philosophers, yes, they exist, though they're usually killed quickly, wrote treatises on the Mordecai paradox, exploring whether an enemy could be so weak that they became invincible through worthlessness. These philosophers were all executed for thinking too much. On the Imperium, Mordecai became an accidental legend. His name was taught at Schola Progenia as an example of survival through unconventional tactics. The Tactica Imperialis added a new chapter on the strategic value of tactical cowardice, immediately classified, then destroyed, then recreated, then classified again. Several Guard regiments began incorporating Mordecai drills, training on how to be so pathetic that enemies wouldn't waste ammunition. These drills were banned after several Guardsmen achieved such levels of cowardice that they created localized morale failures. On Mordecai, he was promoted to sergeant. He fainted, then to lieutenant. He fainted again. Then to captain, he hid in a supply closet for 3 days. Eventually, the administratum gave up and created a special position for him, Garrison Morale Officer, Remote Duty. His job was to exist very far from any actual combat as a symbol of survival. He spent the rest of his days on a peaceful agri-world, hiding in various agricultural structures whenever anyone important visited, and fainting at loud noises. He lived to be 97, making him one of the longest-lived guardsmen in Imperial history. The Brockus 7th incident remains unique in Imperial military history. It proved several uncomfortable truths. Orks could be defeated by denying them the psychological satisfaction of victory. Cowardice, taken to its absolute extreme, could become a form of defense. The administratum would give medals to anyone who survived, regardless of how. Some victories were more damaging than defeats. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. But perhaps the most important lesson, recorded in inquisitorial archives and never released to the public, was this. It is therefore recorded in a file so deeply classified that reading it constitutes a capital offense, that the primary defensive asset of Brockus 7th was not a fortress or a fleet, but a single human whose terror achieved a state of such perfect weaponized uselessness that it became, by a strange quirk of cosmic logic, strategically invaluable. He did not win by fighting. He won by failing to be a valid target, an outcome the administratum to this day is still trying to replicate with a form. The Imperium's response to a hostile universe is, as a rule, to throw increasingly large and pointy objects at it. It has galaxy-sterilizing virus bombs, titans that can level cities just by tripping over them, and space marines who view the laws of physics as more of a polite suggestion.
And yet, on the strategically insignificant world of Brockus VII, all of this was proven entirely redundant. The single most effective defensive weapon in the sector turned out to be one man whose cowardice was so absolute, so pure in its commitment, that it achieved a kind of strategic transcendence, collapsing the enemy's entire reason for being simply by existing pathetically in their presence. But on Brockus VII, the greatest weapon was a man who hid in a latrine for 2 weeks, crying and soiling himself, while accidentally destroying the enemy's will to fight through the sheer magnitude of his worthlessness. The Emperor protects, Mordecai hides. Sometimes in this dark millennium, that's enough.